Tonight, inquiring minds want to know, what is in the safe? The Associated Press reporting the National Enquirer kept damaging stories about President Trump, along with details about hush money payments, locked away in a safe. This as the CEO of National Enquirer's publisher, David Pecker, has been granted immunity. Pecker has protected Donald Trump for years. He's accused of catching and killing negative stories about the president long before he was in the White House. But could Pecker now be the one who takes the president down? Out front now is Jerry George. He worked for the National Enquirer for 28 years, served as the tabloid's LA bureau chief. Good to have you with us tonight. Can you confirm for us that there was this safe full of stories at the Enquirer, Jerry?
Yes, Erica. It's as archaic as it sounds. There was such a device in this digital age where, particularly sensitive story files, including source agreements and contracts and page proofs, were stored for access and protection.
Would the only copy of those stories and those agreements be in that safe? And if so, if they were destroyed, would that be it? Or would there be another copy that lives somewhere else, even digitally?
I think there probably would be much of the content preserved, on a hard drive. Mm-hmm. But, the actual physical signatures on the contracts may actually be in that safe.
How many safes are we talking about?
I worked out of the Los Angeles office, and we had one, and I know that the New York office had one, and I think that's the one we're referring to.
And especially in the New York office, would this only have been filled with stories about President Trump, or what else could be in there?
No, it could turn out to be quite a Pandora's box. I mean, I think anything sensitive, any story that might be potentially litigious, even post-publication, the actual file and the contracts would be held in that safe. So there's a lot of interesting information on a lot of important people, kept on hard copy in a safe.
You mentioned there was one in the LA bureau, too, where you were. Who had access to that? Could you go into that safe anytime you wanted?
Yes.
And was the practice the same then in New York, to your knowledge?
Yes. The bureau chief, which at the time was Barry Levine, had the combination and could open it at will. It also stored, valuables such as cameras and cash. Anything that was remotely sensitive was kept in the safe.
So you were at AMI when David Pecker took over as CEO in 1999, and you say when he took over, there was an edict that came down specifically about Donald Trump that no negative stories would ever appear in an American media publication. Tell us more about that.
Well, Erica, when David Pecker arrived, he sort of brought with him a silent editor, and that was, Donald Trump. They have a long-standing friendship, and David brought that to the table when he accepted the position as CEO.
You said a silent editor. Does that mean that he gave Donald Trump power to kill stories or to even direct stories?
That's exactly what I mean. He relished the proximity to Donald Trump, and he gave him great access. Donald Trump, as you know, loves publicity, so it's not that stories, there were no stories done, but everything that was done with a glow to it. Mm-hmm.
A glow, a golden sheen, perhaps one might say. The Washington Post also reporting during the presidential campaign that the Enquirer would send stories about Donald Trump, but also about his political opponents, to his attorney, Michael Cohen, and that he could weigh in, which sort of leads us to understand why the coverage was the way it was, obviously, during the campaign in terms of what we saw about Hillary Clinton, what we saw about Donald Trump. I know you were gone by then, but this had started out before then. I mean, you talk about him being the silent editor. Also, in 2010, the AP reporting that at Cohen's urging, the Enquirer actually began to promote a potential Donald Trump candidacy. You were still at the Enquirer then. What was that directive?
I was, and I remember that editorial stand. They were very pro Donald Trump in the early days, and with their help, you know, he was propelled into the presidential timber. No one thought that he would actually get elected, but in the end, that's what happened. And American media had a role in that.
And also endorsed him as a candidate, which they had never done before.
Of course.
The president...
It was the first time that they had ever endorsed a presidential candidate.
And Donald Trump, you know, in many ways, were paying the favor. I mean, here's just a little bit of what he had to say.
The National Enquirer did a story. They actually have a very good record of being right.
I've always said, why didn't the National Enquirer get the Pulitzer Prize for Edwards and O.J. Simpson and all of these things?
I mean, you can't knock the National Enquirer. It's brought many things to light, not all of them pleasant.
Glowing words there for the National Enquirer. You talked about how when David Pecker came on, he and Donald Trump already had this friendship. He brought in this new edict. Do you think David Pecker would turn on Donald Trump?
I think ultimately, to save his own skin, he may not have a choice.
What do you think it is that he has that's so damaging?
David Pecker knows where the bodies are buried. David Pecker knows all of the Trump stories that were killed, all the story leads. He pretty much, you know, knows the worst of President Trump's personal life.
What else do you know of that would be out there that would have either been killed or that perhaps the president would have pre-screened and said he didn't want it published?
I know of stories involving, you know, marital discord. I know of stories of infidelities on the president's part, and also stories on the children. I mean, between the Trumps and the Kushners, they have more skeletons in the closet than the Addams family, as the old joke goes.
So
there's a lot of material there.
So this edict about no negative stories about Donald Trump, that also applied to, it's my sense here in what you're saying, that it applied to his children. One would imagine that applies to Melania Trump and perhaps to his ex-wives as well?
Especially.
Especially which one? The current wife or the ex-wives?
The ex-wives and Melania. I mean, you know, very little is reported on their personal life. And, you know, the National Enquirer, which, you know, prides itself on being the investigative tabloid that can eke out the most sensational stories, turned a blind eye to everything that was unpleasant in that family.
When it comes to the now president screening stories as well, did that also apply to screening stories that may have been about his opponents, whether it be in business or anybody with whom he had a feud, someone who he was facing in a presidential election? Is it your sense that he would also have been allowed to weigh in on those stories?
I would go as far as to say that, you know, President Trump and his team fed stories to the National Enquirer on his political opponents.
Jerry George, it is fascinating. We appreciate you taking the time for us tonight. In your words, David Pecker, very dangerous to President Trump because he knows where all the bodies are buried. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.